I'm Tahir Dhindsa and you're watching SDTV. Climate is quite a nuisance and it's a reality as well. Look at the floods Pakistan had to face a couple of years back. And then before that even, on the west side of the Indus, one of the largest disasters the planet Earth has ever seen, which was unusual. And the season was unusual as well. Then there are other migration patterns which are taking place. Then the crop pattern is changing. For example, the sort of rodents are started, they are now exist in the heights, in the gullies and in the mountain, which otherwise they were not. So the whole pattern is changed. One thing is certain, this climate we have to adjust to it. And the global warming is at the root of it. Everyone wants to avoid the tipping point, or at least delay it to an extent where it is the technology comes on and adjustments are made. And emitting less carbon is the way forward. It seems to be that we need to control carbon emissions. But if you want to emit more carbon, then you want to buy credit from those who emit less carbon. So there's a barter or trade because it's a global problem, it has global solutions. Carbon markets are being developed precisely for that. We have today with us Mr. Søren Lutken, who is a senior economist with the UN system in Copenhagen School of Climate Change. Mr. Søren, very warm welcome.
Thank you.
Just a few lines, a few words on that, and we go further. How do you see Pakistan? How these carbon markets are relevant here?
As you just mentioned, Pakistan is seriously affected by climate change, and I think we are all surprised how quickly the climate is changing around us, and a country like Pakistan is obviously seriously affected. We are just having a workshop here today in the SDPI on the equitability of the entire climate change response, and how do we respond to the crisis that we're all facing. And as you just mentioned, it is a global problem, so we are looking for global solutions. Carbon markets are established in order to, in fact, not reduce emissions, but to make sure that emissions are reduced where it is the easiest or it's the cheapest. And the idea is mainly that it's cheaper to reduce emissions, or where it is cheaper to reduce emissions, we should put our investment capital there, given that capital is a scarce resource. So we invest where it's cheaper, and we use those investments and the emissions reduction that comes out of it as offsets sold to countries where emissions reduction efforts are more expensive. And Pakistan is one of those countries where we are considering it to be relatively cheaper to reduce emissions compared to mostly developed countries who would then be the main buyers of credits.
Yeah. So what are the hurdles? Do you think there are some certain problems in Pakistan which are keeping the country back from going whole hog towards these markets?
Yeah, there are serious constraints in Pakistan, as there is in a lot of other developing countries where it's considered that emissions reduction is cheaper than in developed countries. And that mainly concerns financing. So while the emissions reduction may be cheaper, you still have to undertake the investment. If there's no investment capital available, you cannot invest. You will not achieve those emissions reductions, even though they are cheap. So capital constraints are a serious challenge for all those emissions reduction projects that could happen in Pakistan, but may not do exactly for that reason.
Do you think for everything, as you know, you all know why Righty says that the fights are not for the territory rather, but for the stories. And it's the fiction that matters more than history that takes you further. Do you think in Pakistan, first, the narrative and the regulatory framework has to be developed, or the investment has to come first, or they both should be, it should be initiated simultaneously?
I think for the carbon markets, you need both at the same time. And
Right.
what we are here, when we are working with UNEP here in a program with other countries involved, supporting Pakistan in developing the institutional framework to support the carbon market, to make sure that projects that can reduce emissions are also achieving government, not support, but government endorsement, that the government would then endorse that this project can export credits to that buyer. So that framework needs to be in place. And
Along with rules of business and everything.
yes, but the projects that we're looking at are in many cases projects that are normal investment projects. I mean, it could be solar PV plants or wind turbines, or it could be wastewater treatment plants where you are controlling the methane emissions, or it could be landfill projects where you are also controlling methane emissions for safety reasons, not necessarily for emissions reduction reasons. But all those activities are basically known activities. What we need to add to that is the approval structure that allows emission reduction to be sold from those activities. The condition in this context is that projects must be additional. That means they have to be promoted because of the existence of the carbon market. So if you develop the projects first and then you come up with the institutional structure and then we approve them for the carbon market, it is the essence of non-additionality. So you need to have your institutional framework in place first in order to be able to argue that I'm doing this project because I know that I have a possibility to sell carbon credits.
Right. What is the scope for Pakistan?
Or there are many different options for Pakistan to reduce emissions. I mean, the full palette of reduction options is available. We are here in this project I mentioned called Spark 6, supported by the German government. We are currently looking at waste and cement. So emissions reduction from landfills and emissions reduction from cement production. Those two are obvious and first focus areas of the program we're looking at. But there are many other options, and one that we have been continuously looking at on the side is forestry projects, mangrove projects, but mainly forestry projects, because they
More trees.
Yeah, simply plant more trees, but also. When it's important that we're actually planting trees. There has been projects over the past years where the mantra was that we don't need to plant; we can just protect existing forests. So what we call avoided deforestation. But over the past
firewood and other things.
Yes, forests are cut down for different reasons, whether it's for firewood or it's for timber production or whatever. But we've seen that also in Pakistan when the forests are gone, which was part of the reason also for the flooding that Pakistan was suffering from a couple of years ago. We need to replant the trees, not just protect existing trees. And that was what the carbon market in the forestry sector was mainly about. Earlier, that we just protect existing forest. We don't need to plant. That is being changed now. When that mantra is somehow has been challenged, so we cannot count on the emissions reduction from avoided deforestation. We actually need to reduce emissions from actual afforestation, reforestation activities.
Yeah, that's very important because in North, especially if you have visited, we have pine trees mostly. And they take about 200 years to mature if you cut it.
Mm-hmm.
And it is cut precisely for one reason, timber, furniture and doors and all that.
Yeah.
So you're right. One last thing. Do you think that this policy needs to be gelled in some sort of a Paris agreement where Pakistan, the countries like Pakistan, should have some concessions?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Carbon is mostly produced. Forest is right, but the carbon is less carbon, and industrial compatibility sometimes initially, that is, if you don't use fossil fuel and all that, that the other developing country had been using, now they're coming up with a measures like CBAM and all that. So it should be adjusted, like the term, they say, climate justice.
But there are many different things going on in the carbon market. Also these years, and you mentioned yourself the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the European Union is setting up, and it's running its test period now, and it will be fully functioning, or not fully functioning, but functioning at least from 26, and gradually phasing in all industrial sectors by 2030. And
that's pretty close.
That is pretty close. And that is something that will affect exporters in a country like Pakistan exporting into Europe. It is not exactly a carbon market. This is just a restriction where you would be counting on or accounting for your emissions related to your production. If that production has or is causing a larger amount of emissions than a comparable production in Europe, the product meeting the carbon border would be charged at European prices, European carbon prices, for the exceeding emissions of the product. In that way, it actually links up to the European carbon market. So the question would be for a Pakistan exporter, how do we address this now? Do we go for our own emissions reduction in order to avoid the carbon border in Europe, or do we reduce our emissions and sell our emissions in the carbon market, and then meeting the carbon border in Europe, saying, well, we have reduced our emissions, and the carbon border officer would say, well, yes, you have, but you sold your emissions reduction, so it's not yours anymore. So you will be charged at the border. In that discussion, you would, as a company, think that I keep my emissions reduction for myself. I will not sell it in the market, because in the market for emissions reduction, I can maybe get 20 euro per ton. But if I meet the carbon border, I am likely to be charged around 100 euro per ton. So don't join the carbon market for those industries that are exposed to the carbon border in Europe or other countries or regions where carbon borders are coming up.
Right. Thank you very much. And the bottom line is that is a reality. Global warming is a reality, and the pathways has been established, and they are maturing up. Now it is up to the world how to negotiate, and the only thing, the negotiation is the only thing that can create win-win. And I think Pakistan should take the opportunity and take it very seriously. With this, we come to the end of the program. Bye for now.